Welcome to the Groundswell Podcast. I'm Elliot Sands, Executive Director of Live Faith First, and I'm with Daniel Reinhardt, who is currently Associate Director of Student Life and Applied Ministry at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also a former police officer, which gives him a really unique perspective as the author of the book, Rethinking the Police. Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I am really excited for this conversation. We haven't had any conversations around policing on this podcast. And I love the perspective you had. So I'm really interested to dig into that. But before we get there, tell me a little bit about your life. How'd you get where you are? Where'd you grow up? Just give us the cliff notes of your life.
Yeah, so I grew up in a city called Lorain, Ohio, which is just west of Cleveland. And it was a blue-collar town for years. It had a steel mill and a Ford plant that unfortunately went under, and kind of transitioned from a blue-collar city town to more urban poverty over the last 30, 40 years or so. That's where I became a police officer, and that's where I worked for 24 years. And it was my experiences in that community of racially diverse, lower socioeconomic that set the stage for my later PhD research that then combined to be the book, Rethinking the Police.
Good. Why did you write this book? I mean, it's a fairly controversial subject. I mean, we have a lot of stuff whether it's Blue Lives Matter or defund the police, and you kind of found, it seems like a middle ground. I don't even know if there is such a thing as a middle ground between those two, but what caused you to write this book?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that. Before I say that, just because I've already been getting a fair amount of criticism from Christians that will just automatically assume that I don't value the police and kind of put me right into a defund the police. I love the police. And it's ironic to me that Christians would draw that conclusion, because we certainly don't say Luther and Calvin and Zwingli hated the churches, but they called for reform. It was their love for the church that sparked the passion for reform. And so it is with me. But to how I wrote the book, I came to Southern Seminary. I was pastoring I was associate pastor at the time in an all black church under a senior pastor who was African American, and I was a full-time police officer, and I wanted to write about like urban discipleship. And to give you the short version, I ended up kind of getting pushed into, thankfully, writing on how Christian leadership could change policing. And so I didn't have the intentions to do it. And as I did the research for my PhD, my opinion changed. I mean, I saw some issues before, but it was a journey for me of how my thinking changed. Well, that dissertation then became the book. So there wasn't like a thought out plan. It sort of just happened. And here we are.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about in the book of your experience as a rookie cop and then kind of your journey over the 24 years. When you were talking about your training and then your first 6 months kind of under different police officers that would then do another training with you, it really did look like discipleship to me. And I was actually thinking, my goodness, the church could do better at discipleship if they did what the police officers do, maybe a little bit differently, but coming from a Christian perspective. But tell us a little bit about what the training experience is like and kind of how you go from a green, never having done this, to really kind of buying into the culture that exists within a police office.
Yeah, to your comment on discipleship, it's organic discipleship because you are immersed in it. You're embodied in it. And that's more than just lectures or a sermon, right? So you go to the police academy, and the police academy teaches you a lot of the legal side of policing and the official side, but it's still taught by cops. So here are these, seasoned, tenured cops bringing their stories, bringing, who they are into the classroom. And so that's your initial 4 months, which is usually how long the police academy is. And then you go to the on-the-job training, which is going to be at least another 4 months where you're training with a police officer. Yeah. And he has, pretty much complete authority over you to teach you, to grade you. And so you're going to be a pretty attentive listener if you want to keep this job. And so that's how it starts. You're doing the job. You're learning to emulate him or her, your training officer. And everybody around you now is a cop.
Yeah. Right.
And the environment you're in is all police officers. And so it's an indoctrination in a sense. And so it really does shape and form you effectively. And what I mean by effectively is into what they want you to be.
Yeah. 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 And again, that's why when I was reading that, I'm thinking, my goodness, just a critique on church discipleship. It is often going to a Sunday morning sermon and then maybe a community group during the week, but just not necessarily 24/7, but at least the 8 to 12 hours a day of being immersed in police culture. Absolutely. I can imagine changes perceptions, thinking. I'm a people pleaser, so I'm sure that, like you said, if you want to keep your job, you want to do what everybody's asking you to do.
Yeah.
So,
And it gets presented as a group that you want to be part of. And at that point, it's tentative whether they're going to let you in or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, your I don't know that I guess you understand it to some extent while you're going through it, just kind of intuitively, but that's what it is. You're trying to become what you need to be part of this group.
Yeah. So with that in mind, would you give us just Cliff Notes history of policing, kind of how, give us a little bit of a history, of kind of where it started and kind of how we ended up today. I know you could probably talk about that for hours and days, but a little Cliff Notes version there, just to give us some background on what we're looking at.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick version, but just what's important is to understand that this culture formed in the history. So the reason that I provide the police history in the book is so that you can see how this culture was formed. But policing started, believe it or not, based on Christian principles and in reaction to Christians who had issue with the way the British police used force, the way they treated people. So the model started in Great Britain, and there was a Christian man who drafted principles. And policing at this point is more like peacekeeping and public service. That's the model we adopt in the United States. But because we're municipal and not national, and because it comes into an environment that's politically controlled by these city leaders who at the time in America, corruption was rampant, and they go into also prohibition, so the corruption rises. Basically, the police are being governed by corrupt politicians. And they're immersed in the community kind of in peacekeeping social actions. So the corruption gets so bad that by the 20s and 30s, the police are considered completely brutal and corrupt. So the solution to this problem is to pull the police from the community because they need reform, thinking if we separate them, we can stop some of the political control. They empower police chiefs, which makes this very strict hierarchy in police departments. And then they start to focus on enforcement and get away from the social activities. Well, what I argue is because that created hierarchy and that withdrawal, although it did help initially with the corruption, it brought the police into a certain culture where they're separated from the public, which formulated an us versus them worldview. And that worldview then kind of built three trends that I identify, which is social distance from the public, the tendency to dehumanize, and then the ability to abuse. As Christians, we understand those trends. We can just look to history and see that. And I think the church sees that in the issue with the unborn. Here they've been dehumanized, and now abuse is just an easy thing for us to do. Well, the same thing I argue happens in the police, and it's easiest to do it in a country that has these racial tensions when police departments are mostly white. So that's what's forming the culture. And then they're policing urban communities where that social distance is the greatest, which means there's going to be maybe a greater level of dehumanization, a greater level of abuse.
Yeah.
The hierarchy in policing, where police chiefs were empowered, created this strict hierarchy, which I argue these power structures then are plagued with the same problem: social distance from subordinates, the tendency to dehumanize subordinates, and then abuse. So those trends are just infused in the police culture and leadership, and they were put there because of the response to corruption.
Yeah. So I picture Boardwalk Empire. I don't know if you watched that TV series.
No, I've never seen. I don't watch police shows. I can't do it.
It's set in the Prohibition era, and so there's politicians, there's police.
Okay, all right, yeah.
That's what I'm picturing when you describe the corruption that then turned into what we have today. Now, also, an aspect that I've read about, and I'd love to kind of get your feedback on this, is I've heard it said that policing was born out of also enforcing slave laws, then Jim Crow laws, and then even to the point where the war against drugs really ended up being a focus more on the African American community and crack. So also kind of a racist underpinnings to that as well.
Yep.
How do you respond to that when people bring up that argument?
Yeah, so I lay that out in the book, and how the war on drugs, which targeted urban communities, mostly communities of color, how the new police strategy is, I call it, so Michelle Alexander wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, which really exposes the war on drugs. So I call the current police strategy that claims to be objective and non-biased as the new Jim Crow 2.0. And I bring the reader through how the culture and this current strategy that seems like it isn't a problem at face value is deeply embedded with problems. And I'm arguing for systemic racism. And I know as soon as I say that word, it's going to trigger people. Right. But I define it very clearly. And what I mean by it is officers getting in the car every day with good hearts and good intentions that have a system that's directing them in a certain way, that regardless of their intentions, in fact, in the book I put, you could put robots in the car and the same thing is going to happen. You could put black officers in the car and the same thing's going to happen. And before anybody reacts, I just dare you to read the book and see how I lay it out, and before you respond. And again, majority of police officers are doing it with the right heart. The very things that I'm critiquing the police for, I did without realizing I was part of it.
Yeah. I love how you pulled out of that systemic racism, I'll call it claim, but that system, that this isn't necessarily a critique on the person who's actually enforcing the laws. And in fact, like you say, their heart is in the right place. They're doing good, but because of the way the system is built, it's a slope that just puts them right there, right? It's just like if you're at the top of a hill and it's muddy, as soon as you get over that edge, you're just sliding all the way down and to the bottom. And that's just kind of what you make the case that that's what the culture is leading it towards. The culture within the police force, but also the procedures and so on and training. And so it's just all pushing that direction.
Well, it's leading to support, and I would say causing a culture to be blind to the systemic racist elements of what I describe as intelligence-led policing when it's connected to zero tolerance policing, which is the way we often police. It causes you not to see how this will target communities of color with biased policing and lead to greater incidents of abuse. And I use an example in the book where I, with a good heart, trying to solve a problem in a community, end up targeting young black males disproportionately and giving them records that cut off opportunities for them that didn't take place in other communities. And I had no idea that I was doing it.
Yeah. Now, you started by saying you love the police. You were the police. You're not a defunder. I've been, starting the new year. Now I'm in Genesis as I'm reading my Bible, and I just read through, the flood with Noah, right? Mm-hmm. And God just says, my goodness, things are too bad. We just got to wipe the slate clean, start fresh again. And then Babel happens, and he kind of does the same thing there. Like, okay, you all got to spread out. What is it about the police force that you think is redeemable? And because you make a case for, there's a way we can adjust this that I think will be way better than we are today. Why redeem it rather than wipe the slate clean? How would you argue against those?
A great question. So the first thing I want to say, though, as if we could start over. If you rename it and start it over, as if you could somehow detach it from the history, as if you would not be able to lean on current strategies, as if that could possibly happen anyways, is just pretty silly. So that being said, in some sense, you have to reform it. And the reason it can be reformed, because I believe most people get into policing with good hearts, and most of the officers are good officers. And we have the policing philosophies and methodologies that would completely keep us away from the problematic aspects. But before those can be authentically employed and supported, we have to change some cultural and leadership elements. So the simple answer is it's doable because we have the means to police the right way. We even have most of the right people. We just need to change the culture and the leadership so that all can align. And part of that comes from allowing people to see the problem.
Yeah, that's great. All right, you talk about the servant shepherd model as part of the solution. So would you go into a little bit about how do you see, I'm wanting to switch gears here to how do you see redeeming, readjusting the police force as it stands today? What's your solution as you look at this?
Okay, yeah. So this is where the book does get a little philosophical, but what you have to understand is policing is built on foundational principles. Now, maybe the officers, if you went up to them and said, give me the foundational principles of police leadership, they couldn't tell you, but they're intrinsic. They're in there. They're deeply embedded. So I identify 4 foundational principles that are essential that deal specifically with social distance, dehumanization, and abuse that comes from the us-them worldview, right? Mm-hmm. So we start with a new foundation. And then we start with a combination of servant and shepherd leadership, which is a whole framework of leadership that is very practical. So this philosophical foundation is now represented in an embodied leadership model that can focus in specifically on the problems that are creating the culture problem. So it's very strategic. And as you brought up in the beginning, now we could indoctrinate officers differently.
Yeah.
Right. Those foundational principles of leadership and policing that maybe go unidentified are deeply embedded in your mind and are reflected in practical actions, whether you can, quote them and understand them at that cognitive level. So it's building a new model that intentionally changes the culture. And so if you can change the culture, and you can do it, it isn't that difficult when you understand exactly what the problem is.
Yeah.
Then it starts change leadership, change the culture, support different methodologies and philosophies of policing that will effectively bring peace to the community.
Yeah. Describe that culture change. What is that culture change? Maybe contrast it with what it looks like today, but what would you want that culture to look like?
Well, it's going to change the role. Ultimately, police officers see themselves as enforcers. And there is an enforcement aspect, but I'm changing it to the identity of a servant and shepherd, a peacekeeper. And that's a different identity. I was indoctrinated into being an enforcer, a distant, socially distant, emotionally distant enforcer. And so it's changing that identity. It's an identity change that takes place through a leadership that can embody that change and then bring that change into the department and each officer, which then is going to change as your identity changes. Your goals in policing are going to change. How you see the community is going to change. What police success is going to change. Like now we view police success through enforcement statistics. How would that be success? Or even the deterrence of crime, the absence of crime. But it's sort of like a crash diet, I would say today. We measure success. Like if you go on a crash diet, you'll lose 30 pounds in 6 months, right? 2 years from now, you'll be 50 pounds heavier than where you started. So it's a long-term analysis that I'm talking about, bringing peace to the communities. And so the identity change, new culture, new goals in policing, it's really somewhat of a holistic and comprehensive approach.
Yeah. So you talk about statistics. Now, it's kind of a big deal when you live in a city. Like, what are the crime statistics? And I live in San Jose, California, and so big city, urban environments, kind of a lot of the things that you've talked about here today. At one point, we were the safest city and the safest large city in the nation, and that was based upon, murders per capita and crime per capita and gang and so on, right? Now, if that's not, is that how we track it? Or under your new system, is there another way that you how do we know when we've been successful, I guess is what I'd like to ask.
Yeah, great question. So I would say you can implement practices like now. What do they do? So intelligence-led policing gives you, will give you problem areas, problem offenders, which is not wrong in itself. This is good information that we need to track. But then how do the police deal with this problem? They essentially increase enforcement in those areas and kind of occupy and oppress and bring it down. And then the numbers come down. The statistics go up in enforcement, the numbers come down, you basically shove it all back in, right? But what does it do over time? It comes back because it's not sustainable. What does it do over time? It alienates and angers the community, and it comes out in social unrest. So you're not tracking true success. True success will be tracked, and I would say when we can implement community policing through two things. Those numbers are going down because of community support and participation. So crime is coming down as community support and participation is growing. That's a long-term balanced diet that will get you healthy over time. It's not a crash diet, which will lose a bunch of weight and gain it back. And that's what we see now is like, oh, we're successful. No, you just shoved it down. It's going to pop right back up in some other form.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly the experience in San Jose right now.
and then we go, and then they'll say, look, they were successful in New York. Yeah, as long as they shoved it all down, but you can only do that so long. And even if you shove it down and then the police hurt somebody, you find out real quick you can't police a community that decides they don't want to be policed. Look at what happened during George Floyd. Right. So if you can't, and the foundation, some of the foundational principles of policing by Robert Peel, who established the modern police department, was that police legitimacy and cooperation is preferred to coercive force, because you can't police a community that refuses to obey you. They outnumber the police. So once enough people go, that's enough. Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't enforce your way out of this.
Yeah. So as I read it, and please correct me if I'm misstating kind of how I read your description, but what it looked like was there was relationships being built within a community. There was a closeness between police officer, sergeants, lieutenants, so on, captains, and their officers, and then officers in their community. And that really there was a lot more relationship building. In other words, I would actually know the police officers on the beat in my neighborhood, that I would know who they are, maybe not because they've had to come to my house for trouble, but because they're in the community and they're kind of around us. That can sound Pollyannic. I mean, honestly, as I'm reading it, I'm like, okay, is that realistic that we can kind of start building relationships and that kind of helps? What does that look like? Because we know violence isn't going away. I mean, that's obviously been for all of human history. How do arrests look? Like, kind of describe to me, beyond some of these community outreach things, like what does enforcement look like when we're not focused on enforcement? And again, I might be putting words in your mouth.
You're focused on enforcement in relationship, which I would say is effective enforcement. Because right now, what you see, I think, in the urban community, and I grew up in a community like that, and lived in neighborhoods that thought like this. And here's how they can, this is how I believe they see the police. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So when they look at a drug dealer and a gang member, although they normally wouldn't be who they'd want to, this is the average person in the community who they'd want to support, well, the police are the greater enemy. So you understand? So when we show up at scenes and someone's murdered and nobody wants to talk to us and nobody wants to help, and the police go, oh, they just don't care. No, that's indicative of the tension and the conflict between urban communities and the police. So we have to win them back. We need the 98%, and I'm just throwing out a number out of there, of community members who aren't gang members, who don't commit crimes, who live there, who say, I want to support the police. And the way you do that is through community policing. And that doesn't mean there's an officer on every corner. It means you start to target what's important to them, and you show them that they're important to you and that they're part of this community. Whereas today, what do? We're going to go into the very community that we need to support, and we're going to, through intelligence-led zero tolerance, enforce everything: turn signals, littering, jaywalking, write people tickets, aggravate a whole community on Monday, show up Tuesday and say, hi, who are the police? We've come here to help you problem solve and make the community a better place. Good luck. You've got to say, what do we need to focus on? Okay, we need to focus on gangs. We need to focus on prolific offenders, and we need your support.
Yeah.
and you stop enforcing things that society doesn't care about.
Yeah.
And you get peace in your communities, and you get these major crimes down through community support, not just through shoving it down
Yeah.
and waiting for it to pop back up.
Yeah.
When the community says, I value the police more than the gang members, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend mentality goes away, you're starting to get in the right, you're going the right way. So when the police see this reaction, normally it's like, well, forget these people, they don't care. That's the wrong attitude. It should be, how do we win them back? Because this is our community. And they want the same thing we do, if they could trust us.
Yeah. Yeah. Local community here in San Jose, actually, the community leaders are just tired of the gang activity in their communities, tired of bringing in their young kids into the gangs. And so they actually invited other community members and churches to show up, and some of our local, politicians, council members, and so on, just to do a peace walk in the community. And I say that because in communities that are rife with crime, the ones that we would say they don't care, they don't want us there is still a significant portion of that community that's tired of it.
How many cops were there?
I have no idea. I don't think any were invited that I know of.
That should be like, those are so in our community, when we started to have problems after Michael Brown, the chief let me start what we called a chaplains program. And so we had a chaplains program that was focused on dealing with officers in crisis, which you need, but we expanded it. And I recruited a bunch of African-American pastors that I have relationships with in our community to support us, to go to community forums, to talk to the community, to find out what's going on. And they became like representatives. They would see me, I would be with them. And that began to change people's opinion. What we did then kept us from having riots during George Floyd. We showed up with those same guys to crowds of hundreds of people saying, hey, we're here to help. We're here to support you. We don't like this either.
Yeah.
And Cleveland, 20 miles, 30 miles down the road, they're in gas masks. And I'm not tearing into Cleveland because they might have had problems. It was going to happen anyways. But because we did that, it really made a difference. And it kept we had some community support.
Yeah.
And so the police need to what I'm saying is attach to the people who already want the same thing you do, who the public respects. Build relationships with them to bridge into the to the greater community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let them begin to see you as one. People started seeing, this pastor and that pastor and this community leader and Lieutenant Reinhardt, who I was, and some as one group, wanting the same things.
Yeah. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, it starts to change the perspective. It starts to change the attitudes.
You're winning more over. And then all of a sudden, when all you have is the gang members and they're the outliers, you're in a good place to deal with the problem when the community says, yeah, no more.
Yeah. Yeah. You tell the story of I think he was somebody over you at some point, and you show up at a nightclub, and he had built great relationships with a lot of people there, and he was able to walk into what sounded like a pretty tense situation and diffuse a lot of it and ask just standard buyers who weren't really looking for trouble to leave, and they kind of did. Would you tell a little bit about that? That sounds like a kind of a cool success story to me.
Okay, yeah. He was an African-American sergeant who grew up in East Cleveland. And I remember as a new cop, I would watch him. He'd be on calls. He'd ask people who their mother is, who's this, he was always getting to know people and talk to people. And I saw him one time. So he wasn't even from our community. I grew up there. He wasn't even from there. But in his time as a police officer, he built all these connections and relationships just organically, being him, right? Now, one time we had a guy with a knife. I thought we were going to shoot him. We have to shoot him. This was before tasers. And this is a true story. He showed up and said, what's your mother going to say when all these cops shoot you dead? And the guy put the knife down. Because it was him. He knew. I mean, he just had the. But that was an investment that he made day after day after day after day. So when he showed up at that bar brawl, they weren't going to turn on us because that wasn't some unnamed uniform. This was, I'm going to give him credit, Sergeant Dennis Davis. And they knew who he was, and they knew what he was about, and they trusted him. And so he was worth his weight in gold whenever you had a group of people, because they just weren't going to make you the enemy because he was too personal with people. They knew him.
He'd already built those relationships.
That took place every call over 20 plus years. But what if every officer did that to some extent, instead of just, okay, what's your name? I got to go, next call. Yeah. And you treat people like they're just not worth your time. You're busy. He didn't do that.
Yeah, that's good. One last question, actually two last questions, but the penultimate question here. You get a domestic violence call. Those, I believe, are one of the more typical calls that you end up getting. There is a situation that requires an arrest. How does that look different today? How would that look different in your model than it does today?
Well, it's not going to look different in the sense that you're going to have to show up and arrest somebody. And certain people need to be arrested. You need to arrest people for domestic violence. You need to arrest people for all violent offenses. But the difference is it's a personable officer showing up. There's a good chance that the person has either dealt with you or dealt with another officer or heard about the police vicariously, and that changes their perspective. So when you're building, like, a lot of people's hostility with the police is a vicarious experience that they've heard through other people. What happens when those experiences are different? But at the end of the day, there'll be times where you're going to have to say, sir, turn around and put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest, and they're not going to do it, and you have to use force. Yeah. You will never do away with coercive force in a fallen world, but you can minimize it through relationships, police legitimacy, and this is nothing new. This was said 100 years plus years ago.
Yeah. It's just a matter of how do we start implementing that? So,
and I'm not downplaying enforcement, but strategic enforcement in relationship with community support is different than just enforcing everything, believing you're going to deter greater crimes through enforcing small crimes.
Yeah. Well, really resonated with me when you started talking about the social distancing, dehumanization, and abuse, because that concept works in every community. As soon as I'm sitting in my community and I can point at another community and go, oh, those people are. And when I'm not amongst those people, it doesn't matter if I'm police or pastor or just a normal over citizen, if I don't know anybody in that community or I'm not connected at all, I'm so easily dehumanized. I can so easily move towards abuse. Yes. Maybe not a physical abuse, but I'm going to ignore you kind of abuse. Like I'm not going to give you your humanness by even acknowledging that you exist. And so that's a human state that we all, I think, can understand. And when you've put that into a system like you describe in the police force, whether that's in the hierarchy of the police force or within the police force to the community, you can easily see how we end up with some of the tragedies we've had over the last decade against African Americans and people of color in general. And so I love in your model, like, how do we break down those types of barriers? How do we break this down so that rather than this group being the us and them, the dehumanized, socially distanced, then leads to some sort of abuse, becomes these they may not look like me, they may not even think like me, but they are humans like me. And with that, I need to give them, image of God kind of respect.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated your book. So, and it did seem like if there is a middle ground here, you took a middle ground to me that starts to bring could bring a lot of health to communities. Start making some differences.
Yeah, and some of the resistance I've got, police officers are usually pretty resistive to what I have to say because, this was a journey for me. It was tough, and some evangelical Christians, but I would just say that if we don't reform policing, if we don't think about the idea of reform, some radical ideology or response will eventually come in because this is not going to go away, and that will make it worse. Mm-hmm. So back to beginning, reformers often love the institution more than others, or at least as much as others. And I love the police, but some reform is in order.
Yeah. All right, here's my final question for you. What is exciting you right now? What's encouraging you when you think about it? What makes you smile? It could be in your family. It could be at work. It could be something happening in the world around you. But what excites you right now?
What excites me right now? Well, I'm looking forward to hopefully in the future write more and teach criminal justice professionals. I'm excited to, because I think if we embed new leaders with the right thinking, particularly Christian leaders, that they can go out and make a difference in the future. So I'm excited for maybe and hoping and praying that God uses me and puts me in a position to train future criminal justice leaders that will bring the very reform I'm talking about in the book.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you joining us. And for everybody out there today, let's go live faith first.